In a federal courtroom built to crush dissent, Clarence Thomas unleashes a legal ambush on AOC, accusing her of campaign fraud in a trial rigged from the start. But just as the gavel drops and the media declares her finished, Jasmine Crockett storms into the room with one explosive revelation: proof the evidence was forged, and the judge himself orchestrated the deception. Within hours, the courtroom erupts, the Supreme Court spirals into crisis, and Thomas faces a public outcry that could end his career in disgrace. As the nation watches a justice become the accused, one chilling question cuts through the chaos. Just how high does this rot climb, and who will be the next titan to fall when the truth detonates? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The news broke like a thunderclap across the Capitol. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been summoned to testify before a federal tribunal in Washington, D.C. The charge: alleged abuse of campaign funds, an accusation vague in detail but explosive in implication. What stunned even seasoned legal analysts wasn't the charge. It was who authorized the hearing. None other than Justice Clarence Thomas, bypassing all traditional procedural filters to fast-track the hearing under an obscure constitutional clause unused in decades. Within hours, headlines erupted across right-wing media outlets. AOC on trial, the collapse of the progressive idol. Clarence Thomas slams the gavel on woke hypocrisy. The tone was not judicial, it was vengeful. The official summons gave Ocasio-Cortez just 48 hours to prepare. No prior complaints, no official audit, just an emergency session. Signed at midnight. She didn't even have time to return to New York before being ordered into courtroom 3A, the same courtroom used for high-profile corruption trials during wartime. Something was off. This wasn't justice. This was theater, with only one purpose: public execution by legal means. When AOC arrived at the courthouse, the air was thick with humidity and tension. Reporters swarmed the marble steps like wasps. Helicopters hovered above. Cameras zoomed in on her every blink. Dressed in a navy blue blazer and white blouse, her jaw clenched, she walked past the noise with a silence louder than any statement she could give. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Senators, federal attorneys, and a surprising number of corporate observers took their seats like they were watching a premiere. At the center, elevated above the rest, sat Clarence Thomas, expressionless, but radiating control like a man who already knew how the story ended. The flag stood still. The tension didn't. There was no jury, no panel, just a single chair prepared at the witness stand, under glaring lights that didn't flicker. And as AOC took her seat, all of America watched, but only a few realized what was really happening. A trial meant not to uncover the truth, but to bury it alive. And just when the air in the chamber seemed too heavy to breathe, when silence gripped even the reporters trained to stay detached, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was instructed, without warning, to take the stand. She moved calmly, but her eyes betrayed the storm behind them. She had come with her own attorney, a respected constitutional litigator known for dismantling partisan subpoenas. But none of that seemed to matter now. The room had already been set against her. There was no defense table, no opposing counsel listed on the official docket. Just her, the chair, and a row of screens waiting to light up like the walls of an interrogation chamber. What was supposed to be a bipartisan hearing had, without explanation, been restructured into a one-sided review, a format that gave Clarence Thomas the authority to question directly, challenge freely, and rule unilaterally. It was legal in structure, but not in spirit. As she adjusted the microphone in front of her, Thomas leaned forward, not with the measured detachment of a judge, but with the cold familiarity of someone who had waited for this exact moment. "Congresswoman," he began in a voice so measured it felt mechanical, "some might say you've built a career on optics, but how do you reconcile a beautiful image with dirty hands?" The question sliced through the chamber like a scalpel. Audible gasps echoed across the rows. Her attorney shot to his feet, voice controlled but firm. "Objection, irrelevant and overtly personal." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't look up. "Objection is noted and overruled," he said flatly. And just like that, the first cut had landed, and no one stepped in to stop the bleeding. The screens came alive next, filling with digital documents, campaign finance logs, wire transfers, email headers with blurry timestamps. Exhibit A, B, C, each more ominous than the last. Thomas read aloud selectively, highlighting entries from political action committees no one had ever heard of, with acronyms designed to obscure their true origins. "Congresswoman, are you familiar with the Civic Horizons Initiative?" he asked. AOC opened her mouth to answer, but Thomas didn't wait. "Because they've donated $37,400 to your 2022 re-election fund through a shell account routed from an organization based in Nassau. Do you deny that?" Her lawyer interrupted. "We request clarification on the source. These documents haven't been authenticated." Again, Thomas barely reacted. "The source is the public record," he said, eyes still fixed on the printed sheets. "Or are you suggesting Congress has something to hide?" There was no due process, only accusations dressed as questions and evidence curated to humiliate. The documents hadn't been verified through any independent auditor. They were part of a leak circulated to select media outlets 2 days earlier. Leaks that had curiously appeared just hours after the hearing was announced, and yet they were now being treated as gospel. AOC sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her voice stolen not by fear, but by the realization that this wasn't a hearing. This was an ambush, and the courtroom had become a stage for character assassination. Every protest her attorney raised was ignored. Every effort to clarify was shut down. Thomas controlled the tempo like a maestro, and the music was designed to drown her. What made it worse, what made it feel like betrayal on a national scale, was not just the manipulation of evidence, but the posture of legitimacy wrapped around it. The flags behind Thomas, the seal on the wall, the CSPAN cameras capturing every angle. It was theater masquerading as truth, and everyone watching from home had no idea the script was already written. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about guilt. It was about breaking a woman in full view of the country and making sure she had no voice left to explain why. But the courtroom assault didn't end when the microphones were cut. It only changed platforms. The moment AOC stepped out of that building, the headlines hit like coordinated missile fire. News sites lit up with thumbnails of her sitting under cold fluorescent lights, frozen in silence, her hands clasped like someone bracing for impact. AOC caught flat-footed in campaign finance clash. Thomas schools Ocasio-Cortez in live ethics showdown. On TV, they played the same 30-second clip, her pausing before answering a question, blinking under the pressure, as if that hesitation was enough to label her guilty. The footage didn't show the objections that were shut down. It didn't show the altered documents. It didn't show the fear on her attorney's face, or the way Clarence Thomas cut off every response mid-sentence. It was selective memory at scale. And worst of all, even outlets that once stood with her, those who championed progressive voices, were suddenly waiting for more information. In the media war, neutrality became complicity, and AOC was now fighting alone against a narrative that moved faster than the facts. Later that evening, her hotel room was dim, save for the soft glow of a laptop screen and the city lights bleeding through the curtains. She sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, still in her courtroom clothes, creased blazer, heels discarded near the coffee table, hair let down but unbrushed. Her phone buzzed nonstop with missed calls and unread messages, but she ignored them all. What she needed wasn't spin. It wasn't damage control. It was to be heard unfiltered. She opened her laptop, logged into her social accounts, and hit go live. No script, no handler, just her voice, raw and worn, yet unmistakably steady. "They didn't give me space to explain today," she began, eyes locked on the camera. "So I'll make space now." There was no anger in her tone, only exhaustion and something more dangerous. Clarity. "I am not afraid of being questioned. I welcome it. But today I wasn't questioned. I was cornered." She paused, inhaled, and delivered the truth like a closing argument to the nation. "I'm not afraid of being judged. I'm afraid the system has stopped caring about being fair." For a moment, the feed was quiet. Then the comments flooded in. Not bots, not hashtags. People. Real people. Waking up. But outside that room, in studios and strategy rooms, the narrative machine roared on, and AOC knew this wasn't the climax. It was only the first shot. And while the courtroom was still echoing with the sound of silence left behind by AOC's livestream, somewhere nearly 1,300 miles away, Jasmine Crockett was watching, alone and fully awake. Sitting in a modest office suite in downtown Dallas, her heels off, a cold cup of coffee untouched on the table, she stared at the grainy live stream playing across her laptop. The signal lagged slightly, but not enough to miss the moment that made her sit up. A document flashed across the courtroom screens. Exhibit E, Thomas called it. Jasmine leaned in. Her eyes locked on the formatting. Her brain caught the margins, the font spacing, the watermark style. It wasn't unfamiliar. In fact, it was hauntingly familiar. She had seen it before. 2 years ago, buried inside a case she had personally helped dismiss. A campaign finance dispute in Georgia involving a forged PAC donation trail. The file used today against AOC had the same structure, the same missing data rows, even the same spreadsheet tab name. But this wasn't déjà vu. It was digital fraud, and someone had recycled it. The worst part wasn't that the document was fake. The worst part was that Clarence Thomas had presented it as legitimate federal evidence on live television to destroy a sitting congresswoman. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She pulled open her drawer, retrieved an encrypted drive, and inserted it into her laptop. Within seconds, she had the original file open, time-stamped, logged, and authenticated by a forensics analyst 2 years ago. The match was exact, except for one row added and one name replaced. The room felt colder now, not because of fear, but because she understood what this meant. If this could happen to AOC live at the federal level, then the judiciary was no longer broken. It was weaponized. She didn't wait for permission. She gave orders. "We're going to D.C. now," she said to her advisor, already dialing. "I want our legal team in the air within the hour. We bring everything." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. There was steel in her tone, and a kind of quiet fury that only surfaced when the law itself had been betrayed. As her staff scrambled, Jasmine packed her bag with precision. The drive, a legal binder, and one navy blazer. She didn't bother with makeup or sound bites. This wasn't a press play. This was war. 35 minutes later, she was in the back of a black SUV on the way to Lovefield, her phone buzzing with texts from colleagues watching the same live stream with growing dread. "It's worse than we thought," one message read. Jasmine didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the window, city lights blurring past. Her mind replayed Thomas's voice, calling AOC a pretty face with dirty ethics. It wasn't just cruel, it was deliberate, targeted, strategic, and it violated everything Jasmine had spent her career defending. As the plane lifted off into the night, heading toward a city caught in a storm of silence and power, Jasmine opened her laptop one more time. She clicked play on the archived courtroom stream, paused it at the exact frame of the fake document, and whispered, not for effect, but because it was all she needed to remind herself why she was going. This isn't politics anymore. This is a lie with paperwork. And she was done letting lies win. And just as the third hour of the hearing ticked past, after 3 days of unanswered accusations, suppressed objections, and a growing sense that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been left to face a firing squad disguised as a legal proceeding, the room changed. The rear doors of courtroom 3A creaked open, not loudly, but sharply enough to break the illusion of order. Heads turned. Cameras shifted. Jasmine Crockett entered with the quiet intensity of someone who didn't come to ask questions. She came for answers. Dressed in a tailored black suit, her posture straight and unflinching, she didn't glance at the press row or the gallery. She didn't pause to acknowledge the murmurs spreading like wildfire through the room. Her eyes locked directly on the bench, and without breaking stride, she made her way to the well of the chamber. She stopped in front of the clerk's table, her voice clear and firm, not loud, but undeniably present. "Madam Clerk, I'm Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas. I'm here to serve as special legal counsel to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez." The room stilled. Even the stenographer's keys went silent. Clarence Thomas, sitting at the elevated bench, leaned forward slowly, eyes narrowing. "That request is denied," he said sharply. "You are not credentialed in this proceeding. You hold no recognized status here." His words echoed, but Jasmine didn't flinch. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she replied, holding up a printed statute. "Under Federal Procedural Provision 18-4B, emergency counsel can be appointed mid-session if the defendant affirms the appointment and if procedural fairness is in question." Her tone never rose. It didn't need to. The truth was heavier than volume. Thomas leaned back, exhaling slowly. The power in the room shifted by inches. Then he looked directly at AOC. "Is this your counsel?" he asked, his voice tinged with reluctance. AOC, still seated under the punishing lights, looked up at Jasmine, her first real ally in days, and nodded. Not with desperation, with conviction. "Yes," she said clearly, "I authorize her representation." That moment, just a nod and a sentence, felt like a rupture in a dam. The clerk double-checked the statute. The legality was real, the precedent was rare, and the permission, now granted, changed everything. Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't look triumphant. She simply opened the folder in her hand, placed it gently on the table, and said the words no one expected to hear in that room that day. "Then let's talk about the truth." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was tense, electric, the kind of silence that comes right before everything turns. The silence that followed Jasmine's recognition as legal counsel was brief, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something shifts beneath your feet. She stepped forward, eyes fixed on the bench, her posture steady but electric with purpose. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear, "before this hearing proceeds, I move to challenge the integrity of one of the key exhibits presented against my client, specifically Exhibit E, the financial document allegedly showing illicit PAC contributions to Representative Ocasio-Cortez." She turned to the monitor behind her, holding up a printed copy of the document. "This file was submitted the morning this hearing began, stamped, logged, and used as primary evidence to justify the accusations before this chamber. But what this court hasn't been shown is where it came from, or what it used to look like." She clicked a remote in her hand. A second version of the same document appeared on the courtroom screen, side by side with the one used by Clarence Thomas. The room tensed as the similarities became clear. Same columns, same formatting, same amounts. "This," Jasmine said, pointing to the screen, "is the original source file. It was part of a legal investigation from 2 years ago in Georgia. The structure is identical, except for a few convenient edits." She zoomed in on the signature line of the new exhibit. "This version is signed by a man named Robert M. Decker. But there's a problem, Your Honor." She paused, not for effect, but to let the weight of what she was about to say land clean. "Mr. Decker has been deceased for over a year and a half. His name and digital signature were pulled from a prior public filing, then inserted into this document to give it a false appearance of legality." A ripple of disbelief moved through the room. AOC's jaw tensed. Reporters blinked at their screens, already drafting headlines in their heads. Jasmine didn't flinch. She continued, her tone sharpening. "This isn't an oversight. It's not a clerical mistake. It's fabrication, presented under the authority of this court, and it was used to build a public narrative against my client before she was ever allowed to speak." She stepped closer to the bench, lowering the tone of her voice just enough to make every word sting. "I ask this court, and the American people watching, to consider the implications. If we allow documents like this, documents that are doctored, manipulated, and resurrected from past cases, to be passed off as truth, then this isn't justice, it's performance, and we are all complicit." There was no applause, no gasps, just a long, stunned stillness, like the air itself was deciding whether it could bear the truth Jasmine Crockett had just put on record. And for the first time since the trial began, the pressure in the room shifted, not toward the defendant, but back toward the bench. The room was holding its breath. The accusation had been made, the forged signature exposed, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. Now it was time to prove it. Jasmine Crockett turned toward the clerk's desk, nodded once, and motioned to the back of the courtroom. A man rose quietly from the gallery, dressed not in a flashy suit or political uniform, but in the calm, muted tones of someone who preferred data to drama. His name was Dr. Miles Kessler, a veteran forensic analyst who had served as a consultant on more than a dozen federal fraud cases. He didn't smile as he walked forward. He didn't nod to the cameras. He simply approached the stand like a surgeon approaching an operating table, focused, precise, and ready to dissect the lie. After being sworn in, Kessler placed a thin stack of documents on the witness desk and opened to the first page. "Your Honor," he began, speaking with the quiet authority of someone who knew his words would carry weight, "I was asked to perform a forensic analysis on the metadata of Exhibit E, the campaign finance record used to support the charges against Representative Ocasio-Cortez." He clicked a button on the monitor beside him. Two versions of the same file appeared side by side on the screen. "What you see here," he said, pointing, "is the file submitted to this court. And here, this is the same file's metadata log, retrieved from its edit history. What's concerning is not just what's in the document, but how it got there." He highlighted a section in red. "This file was modified 4 separate times in under 2 hours. Each edit came from a different user ID, none of which are registered to the federal campaign oversight system." The gallery stirred. Thomas remained still. "The final version, the one you received, was saved just 23 minutes before it was submitted into evidence. That's unusual on its own. But what's more troubling is that the metadata shows 2 overwrites, one to scrub the previous timestamps and another to embed a false author ID. In layman's term," he continued, glancing at the senators in the room, "this document was cleaned, altered, and disguised by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." He paused briefly, then added, "There's more." The signature included on the document, Robert M. Decker, was digitally inserted. Mr. Decker passed away 18 months ago. His name was pulled from an unrelated filing and overlaid to give this document false legitimacy. This wasn't a typo. It wasn't an error. It was deliberate fabrication. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of news crews, realizing what they had just heard. AOC blinked hard, jaw clenched, staring down at her folded hands. Jasmine Crockett kept her eyes on the bench, and Clarence Thomas, once so commanding, sat like a statue. The truth hadn't just entered the room. It had been sworn in, cross-referenced, and laid bare for the world to see. Even after exposing the doctored evidence, Jasmine Crockett stood before the court with the unmistakable composure of someone who had one final card to play, and knew it would shake the walls. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She simply took a measured breath, as if to remind herself that this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. Personal to AOC. Personal to every public servant who'd ever had the truth twisted against them in plain sight. "Before we move on, Your Honor," she said, her tone steady, almost clinical, "there's one more item the defense wishes to submit for review, marked Exhibit H." Her hand slipped inside the folder once more, this time retrieving a small black envelope, which she held with visible care. "Contained within is a digital audio file," she continued. "It was provided under confidential protection by a federal employee, a clerk, someone who works within these very chambers." She paused and let that last sentence settle. A few murmurs stirred in the gallery. This person came forward voluntarily, under penalty of perjury, and stated that they were pressured directly to alter metadata on the campaign finance exhibit previously discussed. The courtroom hushed again, but this time the silence felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Jasmine handed the envelope to the court clerk, who inserted the drive into the system console. Her voice dropped to a register just above a whisper, though every word was crystal clear. "The defense requests permission to play this recording for the court and to have it entered into the record." Clarence Thomas didn't answer right away. He glanced to the side as if weighing 1,000 variables behind his unmoving expression. Then, with the faintest flick of his wrist, he nodded to the technician. Permission granted. The lights dimmed slightly as the courtroom monitors came to life. For a few seconds, all that could be heard was a faint hiss of white noise, room tone, background hum. Then a voice emerged. Male, deep, deliberate, Not rushed, not angry, but chillingly casual in its confidence, like a man too powerful to worry about being overheard. As long as it's enough to bury AOC, who the hell cares if it's real or not? The words fell like a hammer through the room. A long, excruciating silence followed. Not the kind that came from confusion. The kind that came when every person in the room understood exactly what they'd just heard, but couldn't quite believe they'd heard it. No one moved. The air in courtroom 3A was suddenly too heavy to breathe. Reporters sat frozen, their hands hovering above keyboards. A junior aide in the gallery pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. The technician at the soundboard turned pale. Even the clerk's eyes flickered upward toward the bench, because this wasn't a headline anymore. This was a voice, a sentence, a confession, not shouted in anger or muttered in fear, but spoken with the lazy certainty of someone convinced they were untouchable. Jasmine didn't speak yet. She waited. Let the silence work. Let the court, let the nation feel the weight of what it means to hear corruption spoken out loud. Not by a political operative, but by a man wearing the robe of ultimate judicial authority. Then the screen behind her shifted. A new overlay appeared, a waveform graph, accompanied by a digital authentication report. At the bottom of the screen, in unmistakable white text on a black background, it read, Voice print, match 94.7%. Clarence Thomas. Beneath that, source, Federal Bureau of Acoustic Forensics, Office of Legal Evidence Integrity. Now Jasmine turned toward the judge, not toward the bench of Thomas, but toward the presiding chair, the one technically responsible for admitting evidence. Your Honor, she said evenly, what we've just heard is not speculation. It's not out of context. It's not interpretation. It is, by all forensic standards, authentic. This voice belongs to Justice Clarence Thomas. And the content of that recording is not legal analysis. It's not a procedural comment. It's a statement of intent, a statement of motive, and a statement of disregard for due process and the truth itself. Her voice didn't tremble. It was almost too calm, like someone refusing to let the truth be diluted by anger. This isn't about a procedural flaw, she added, each word deliberate. It's about trust, about whether the highest court in this country can be allowed to weaponize its authority to destroy reputations with manufactured evidence. She paused again, then took a slow step back from the podium, letting the screen remain in full view. The American people are listening, and they deserve to know who's speaking. Across the room, AOC sat perfectly still. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She had endured everything: accusation, humiliation, character assassination. But now finally the tide had turned. Not through rhetoric, not through outrage, but through something far more dangerous to the powerful: receipts. And Clarence Thomas, so often the one asking the questions, had just become the answer. And as the final waveform faded from the courtroom monitors, as Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the bench and silence reclaimed the air like a returning tide, the weight of what had just been heard didn't stop inside the chamber. It detonated far beyond it. Within seconds, reporters leapt to their phones. A CNN producer whispered, "Clip that now," into her headset, while a New York Times journalist texted a single sentence to his editor. Thomas caught on tape, real voice, real words. But it wasn't just the press. It was everyone. Congressional staffers, lobbyists, law students live streaming the hearing during lectures. Thousands, then tens of thousands of Americans were watching on public feeds when the audio file was played. They heard the voice. They read the forensic match. They didn't wait for permission to react. The clip began spreading like wildfire, first in private group chats, then in Twitter threads, then cut into reels and TikToks with only 6 words in bold over black. Who the hell cares if it's real? A sentence that didn't just destroy credibility, it incinerated it. By the time Jasmine returned to her seat beside AOC, the internet had already shifted. On X, formerly Twitter, a hashtag began to climb with brutal speed. # Justice for AOC. It started as a whisper: students, young voters, campaign volunteers, who remembered why they'd voted for her in the first place. But the second wave came faster, louder, and angrier. Attorneys, civil rights leaders, and constitutional scholars who had spent years defending the sanctity of process, only to now witness that very process wielded as a weapon against a member of Congress. And then the next hashtag landed. Heavier, meaner, unforgiving. Thomas Treason. It surged like a riptide, retweeted by celebrities, journalists, sitting House members, even retired federal judges. The word treason wasn't used lightly. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a collective scream against a system that had just been caught with its hand, not only in the machinery, but on the trigger. Screens lit up in cafes and gyms, in subways and break rooms. On college campuses, students crowded around TVs in stunned disbelief as the voice replayed on loop. As long as it's enough to bury AOC, no edits, no music, just the raw, flat truth and the staggering silence afterward. Within 30 minutes, the video had reached over 12 million views. TikTok creators stitched the audio over images of AOC sitting under fluorescent lights. Journalists played it alongside quotes from Thomas's past rulings on ethics and judicial restraint. Legal scholars posted side-by-side transcripts of what he said in court versus what he said off mic, and the contrast was damning. On Reddit, a thread titled, "This isn't a trial, it's a setup," climbed to the top of /r/politics within 12 minutes, with over 14,000 upvotes and comments flooding in by the second. I don't care what party you're in. This is a disgrace. This is why people don't trust the courts. Clarence Thomas just became the Watergate tape. But it wasn't just digital noise. It was coordinated outrage. Petitions were launched demanding an immediate ethics review. Law professors drafted open letters. Protesters began gathering outside federal courthouses from New York to Oakland with signs that read, "We heard him too, and truth isn't treason, but this is." Inside the Capitol, aides scrambled to respond. AOC's team, caught between relief and emotional shock, had no comment. Jasmine Crockett declined all press for the moment, instead staying beside her client, not as a politician, but as a shield, the kind forged in quiet outrage and wielded with surgical focus. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply watched the monitors as the world began doing what the courtroom had not. Listen. Every network, MSNBC, ABC, even Fox, had cut into regular programming. They didn't just report the story, they played the clip in full. News anchors, visibly stunned, paused after the tape ended, grasping for words to make sense of what viewers had just witnessed. "He said the quiet part out loud," one anchor said bluntly. "This isn't partisan anymore," said another. "This is structural." By nightfall, international press had joined. Le Monde referred to it as le scandale judiciaire du siècle. The BBC simply called it the tape. On Al Jazeera, political analysts debated whether this would mark a turning point in global trust in the U.S. judiciary. Even foreign diplomats, usually silent on internal matters, began tweeting cautiously worded statements about the need for judicial integrity in all democratic systems. Meanwhile, online, the hashtags refused to fade. Dar Justice for AOC became more than a slogan. It became a banner under which millions gathered. People began sharing their own stories of being disbelieved, silenced, undermined, of how it feels when truth is treated like an inconvenience. A single TikTok of a teenage girl holding a sign that read, "I'm not AOC, but I know that voice," was shared nearly 200,000 times within an hour. Underneath it, one comment stood out. "She didn't break. She waited, and the truth came." But nothing captured the moment quite like the replays of AOC's face during the hearing. That moment, after the clip had played, after the waveform and authentication were shown, when she just sat there, still and silent, was captured in high-resolution stills that circulated like portraits of resistance. Her jaw clenched, her hands folded, her eyes rimmed with restrained fury, not because she was broken, but because after everything, the truth had finally spoken on her behalf. And it wasn't just the public watching now. Inside law firms, clerks pulled up procedural codes. Inside government agencies, emails were exchanged with subject lines like, "Urgent, clarification on judge audio admissibility." Senators, including some from Thomas's ideological circle, suddenly found themselves cornered by reporters asking for comment. A few released lukewarm statements about awaiting all the facts. Others vanished entirely from public view, hoping to ride out the firestorm. But the tide wasn't waiting, because this wasn't just about one moment of corruption. This was about the machinery behind it, about how someone so high, so protected, so cloaked in institutional armor could say something so reckless, so damning, and believe no one would ever hear it. But now the world had heard it, and the world doesn't unhear. Back inside courtroom 3A, as dusk began to press against the high windows, the courtroom remained seated, but the silence had transformed. It was no longer the silence of fear or domination. It was the silence that follows a tectonic shift, when everyone present realizes that something irreversible has just happened, but the next move hasn't yet been spoken. Jasmine Crockett sat beside AOC without saying a word. She didn't need to. Her job, at least for this moment, was done. She had carried the truth into a room that had long since closed its ears, and now the walls were bleeding with it. Outside, the protesters' chants began echoing through the stone corridors of the Capitol. We heard the voice. We demand a choice. Justice is not above the law. She stood alone. She's not alone now. And in every corner of the internet, on every screen, under every trending banner, one sentence kept repeating itself over and over again. As long as it's enough to bury AOC, followed by the same reply, written by thousands, whispered by millions. It wasn't. She's still standing. And as the sound of that sentence, as long as it's enough to bury AOC, continued to reverberate across the country like a national betrayal caught on tape, it didn't take long for pressure to build from within the Capitol itself. The shock had passed. What followed was rage, but not the performative kind. Not partisan shouting across cable news panels. This was something more rare. Righteous discomfort that crossed the aisle. It started behind closed doors in whispered conversations in elevators, overburned coffee in committee rooms. But within hours, those whispers hardened into emails, into statements, into formal calls for action. Senator Alan Whitford, a moderate Republican from Pennsylvania, known for rarely weighing in on judicial matters, was the first to break the line. His post hit X like a bolt of lightning. Any justice caught manipulating evidence or aiding its manipulation must immediately recuse, no matter their rank. This isn't about politics. This is about preserving the courtroom as sacred space. Within 30 minutes, his post had been shared over 90,000 times. But more importantly, it opened the floodgates. Soon came Senator Marcia Hill, a conservative from Utah who had clashed publicly with AOC in the past, stepping to the podium outside her office. I've disagreed with Representative Ocasio-Cortez on nearly everything, but I will not stand silent while a Supreme Court justice abuses the robe to silence political opponents. That's not justice. That's tyranny with a legal font. The line had been crossed, not between parties, but between those defending institutions and those dismantling them from within. Back inside the Capitol, a rare emergency meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee was convened. AOC was not present. Neither was Jasmine Crockett. They didn't need to be. The conversation wasn't about them anymore. It was about Clarence Thomas, and it was happening fast. C-SPAN cameras captured senators entering the chamber with grim expressions and muted tones. Microphones caught snippets. This isn't sustainable. If we don't say something now, when do we? If the integrity of the bench falls, what's left? Within that session, Senator Donnelly, a centrist Democrat from Michigan, circulated a letter titled Joint Resolution Requesting Immediate Recusal of Justice. Clarence Thomas from any further oversight involving Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The title was long. The message was not. It read, given the clear conflict of interest, combined with the authenticated audio evidence currently in public domain, we, the undersigned, formally urge Justice Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from all further proceedings related to this case. If he fails to do so voluntarily, we will seek legislative remedies to enforce such recusal through constitutional channels. By the end of the hour, 7 Republicans had signed it, along with 36 Democrats and 2 independents. That alone would have been unprecedented, but it didn't stop there. because by the time the cameras caught wind of the letter, it had already been delivered, not to the press, but to the chambers of the Supreme Court itself. Reporters rushed to confirm. Lines lit up at news desks from D.C. to New York. "Is this real?" producers whispered. "Did they really send it straight to the court?" The answer came not from a leak, but from a live press conference outside the Capitol, where 4 senators, 2 from each party, stood shoulder to shoulder before a wall of microphones. The most unexpected voice was Senator Brandon Tate, a libertarian-leaning Republican from Arizona, known for his aggressive defense of judicial independence. But even he seemed shaken. He didn't read from a script. He didn't recite talking points. He looked directly into the camera and said, "I've defended this court. I've defended Justice Thomas. I've defended the process. But today I can't defend the indefensible." That voice on the tape doesn't belong in a courtroom. It belongs in a courtroom as a defendant. Gasps rang out among the press. Even veteran correspondents blinked. This wasn't political theater. This was institutional revolt. And all the while, the American people weren't waiting for permission to judge. On X, Tishuri recused Thomas now started trending within 17 minutes of the letter's delivery. It was joined by posts from former federal prosecutors, retired judges, and even constitutional historians, many of whom had never before publicly questioned the legitimacy of a sitting Supreme Court justice. But the audio had made silence impossible. On college campuses, students gathered in lecture halls demanding that law schools issue statements. In major cities, digital billboards flashed the now infamous waveform graphic from the voice print match alongside the phrase, "This is not justice." Even the typically reserved American Bar Association issued a rare public advisory, stating, "No member of the judiciary, regardless of rank, may ethically preside over a matter in which they have demonstrated bias or prejudgment. We urge Justice Thomas to consider the precedent he is creating." Inside courtroom 3A, the tension grew minute by minute. AOC and Jasmine had not yet re-entered. The room was in a legal holding pattern, waiting for clarity that couldn't be ignored much longer. All eyes, quietly unspoken, were on the man in the robe at the bench. Clarence Thomas sat unmoved, his expression carved from stone, but his silence now said more than any ruling he could issue. He had not responded publicly, he had not addressed the voice, but he hadn't left either. He was still on that bench, still presiding over a case in which his impartiality was now less than dust, and the pressure only climbed. A group of House members led by Representative Elijah Rodriguez of Florida, a centrist Democrat with deep military credentials, called an emergency press briefing outside the Rayburn building. He held up the same letter from the Senate and added, "If this chamber does not act with urgency, then we are all complicit in allowing judicial corruption to stand unchecked. I don't care what robes you wear. If you manipulate justice to crush your enemies, you don't belong in a courtroom. You belong in history's darkest footnotes." Chants erupted from the crowd behind him. "Recuse now! Recuse now! The court is not a weapon. No judge is above the truth." It wasn't just performance. These weren't empty slogans. They were born of something Americans had not felt this deeply in years. Disgust not at partisan betrayal, but at the betrayal of the Constitution itself. Back on Capitol Hill, several lawmakers began referring to the situation not as an ethics issue, but as a national judicial emergency. Think tanks scrambled to assess the legal implications if a Supreme Court justice refused to step aside amid a verified conflict. Would a refusal trigger a broader investigation? Could it trigger impeachment? No one knew for certain, but one thing had become crystal clear. The court was now on trial, and the man presiding over that trial, Clarence Thomas, was no longer seen as the judge. He was the crisis. In state legislatures across the country, local representatives began proposing symbolic resolutions, urging judicial reform. Late-night news shows, once quick to divide every issue down party lines, found themselves unexpectedly unified. Even conservative legal analysts, who had long shielded Thomas from criticism, admitted on camera that the recording had created an irreversible breach of public trust. And while senators stood shoulder to shoulder before cameras, while the hashtags burned across every screen in America, and while chants echoed from courthouse steps and Capitol rotundas, Clarence Thomas said nothing. Not a word, not a line, not even a glance of acknowledgement. He remained perched on the bench like a man buried in his own myth, cloaked in silence so deliberate it no longer looked like control, it looked like collapse. AOC remained seated in the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breathing shallow but steady, while Jasmine Crockett sat beside her like stone. They didn't speak either. They didn't need to, because the silence coming from the bench was now the loudest voice in the room. As pressure surged from every branch of government, across party lines, across state lines, across ideological lines, reporters camped outside the Supreme Court steps, waiting for any sign of movement, any shift in posture. Clerks were tight-lipped. Aides refused to comment. The court's marble facade, once imposing in its grandeur, now felt like a wall built not to protect justice, but to shield someone who had betrayed it. Then at 9:42 a.m. the next morning, a statement appeared on the Supreme Court's official website. It wasn't addressed to the public. It wasn't signed by any single justice. It was anonymous, cold, and clinical. The court is currently reviewing its internal procedures regarding evidentiary oversight and ethical review protocols. No further comment will be provided at this time. That was it. No denial, no clarification, no defense, just a fog of formality, strategically worded to say everything and nothing all at once. Within minutes, it was dissected across the nation. Legal experts called it non-committal to the point of insult. Ethicists branded it a masterclass in institutional evasion. Protesters called it what it was, cowardice behind marble. The anchors on every major network paused before reading it aloud, visibly hesitant, as if giving it voice lent it undeserved credibility. On MSNBC, a former federal judge shook her head live on air. "I've written 100 of these statements in my time. This one? It's a white flag without the courage to admit its surrender." But the country didn't need legalese to understand what was happening. People felt it, they saw it, they knew it. The man who had once sat atop the highest judicial pedestal in the land, cloaked in the sanctity of precedent and power, had been caught, and now he was hiding. And that hiding, that silence, was an answer. In law schools, professors changed their lesson plans to examine not just the ethics of power, but the anatomy of its unraveling. On social media, screenshots of the vague court statement were captioned with razor-sharp clarity. Translation: "We got caught. We're stalling. This isn't review. This is panic in a robe. He spoke on tape. And now the court has nothing to say?" Hashtags evolved into slogans. Slogans became chants, and chants soon turned into printed banners stretched across courthouse fences in cities from Chicago to Atlanta. "You said the quiet part. Now say goodbye. Recusal is not a consequence. It's a start." Outside Thomas's own home in Virginia, a quiet line of demonstrators stood holding candles by dusk. They didn't chant. They didn't scream. They just stood, row after row, holding in large quotes from his leaked audio, alongside the Supreme Court's deflective statement. One sign read, "You used the court to bury her. Now you've buried yourself." And still, Thomas remained silent. He did not recuse. He did not speak. He did not even release a second clarification. The courtroom remained technically open, but everyone understood. Its authority had been drained. The hearings no longer had the tone of a judicial proceeding. They had the tension of a crime scene waiting to be roped off. AOC, once the accused, now looked less like a defendant and more like a living rebuke. Her very presence was unbearable for those who had hoped she would fold. Jasmine Crockett's folder remained unopened on the desk before her, because she knew now that the evidence had spoken louder than any argument she could deliver. What followed in the hours after the court statement wasn't legal process. It was public reckoning. Editorial pages that had once defended Thomas's jurisprudence began to pull back. The Washington Post ran a front-page op-ed titled, "The Bench is Not a Throne." The Wall Street Journal, normally restrained, published a brutal centerfold graphic titled, "The Ethics That Vanished in One Sentence." Even longtime defenders of Thomas, clerks, scholars, conservative media figures, found themselves cornered. They tried to argue that the voice on the tape didn't technically admit to a crime, but those arguments wilted against the sheer force of public clarity. Because this wasn't about criminal law anymore. It was about trust. And trust, once broken at that altitude, doesn't get patched. It shatters permanently. A new phrase entered the political bloodstream: judicial integrity collapse. It was clinical, cold, and used with growing frequency by people on both sides of the aisle. The Supreme Court, which had for decades held an uneasy reverence as the last stop for moral arbitration, now found its name being spoken with open skepticism. A poll released that evening by Pew Research revealed that public trust in the court had dropped 21 points in 48 hours, the steepest decline since the 2000 Bush versus Gore decision. Legal historians called it a moment as devastating as the Dred Scott backlash, but born from within. Inside the Supreme Court itself, internal murmurs began to leak. Clerks were stunned. Some whispered that they hadn't known about the audio. Others admitted they'd heard rumors of overreach, but never imagined it would surface this way. One anonymous staffer was quoted saying, "We weren't prepared for the court to become the accused." And still, Thomas said nothing. No resignation, no apology, no movement. But perhaps that silence, rigid, hollow, defiant, was the most honest thing he could have offered. Because in that silence, the public no longer saw a figure of law. They saw a man exposed, a man whose decades of rulings, dissents, and speeches were now being replayed through a new lens. A lens cracked by 6 reckless words and the damning stillness that followed them. In homes across the country, families who had once ignored Supreme Court cases entirely now found themselves leaning over dinner tables, asking questions they never thought they'd have to. Can a judge be punished? What happens if the court is broken? How long has this been going on? And the answers, vague, incomplete, complicated, couldn't compete with the one thing that everyone now understood. The man in the robe had abused the silence entrusted to him, and now that silence was collapsing under its own weight. It wasn't just a fall from grace, it was a collapse of moral credibility, not just for Thomas, but for the symbol he once represented. And no carefully worded statement, no procedural delay, no strategic silence would be enough to put that symbol back together again. And as the silence around Clarence Thomas deepened into something darker than denial, the world turned to the woman who was supposed to be destroyed. The headlines that once screamed scandal now whispered retraction. The pundits who once scoffed now shifted in their chairs. The courtroom, once a cage built from doubt and accusation, had been forced open not by mercy, but by evidence, fury, and truth. And as the final procedural motions concluded behind closed doors, the decision was delivered without theatrics, just 3 lines on a printed statement. All charges dismissed, case deemed procedurally compromised. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is cleared of all wrongdoing. No applause erupted in the courtroom. No gavel struck with poetic justice, just stunned stillness, as if even the walls were embarrassed by the violence they had witnessed. AOC sat in her chair for a moment longer than necessary. Her legal team behind her quietly stood. Jasmine Crockett said nothing, only reached over and touched her elbow with calm assurance. The crowd in the gallery remained hushed, not from apathy, but reverence. They had just watched a public crucifixion undone. And for the first time since the ordeal began, AOC rose, not to defend herself, not to plead her innocence, but to walk forward, head high, shoulders squared, every step a defiance against the people who thought she wouldn't survive this. The press conference was called 1 hour later. Cameras were already in place, tripods jammed together like rifles pointed at a battlefield long after the war had ended. Outside the federal courthouse steps in Washington, D.C., a podium had been hastily erected, draped in the seal of the House Judiciary Committee. Behind it, 2 mics, just 2. No legal spokesperson, no PR manager, just AOC and Jasmine. When they stepped up to the microphones, the crowd hushed as if entering a cathedral. Reporters, seasoned and cynical, leaned forward. Not one of them expected what they saw. AOC in a plain navy suit, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a low bun. Jasmine beside her, arms behind her back. Expression composed like a closing argument waiting to be spoken aloud. AOC took a single breath and began. There are moments in public life, she said, voice even, when the price of telling the truth is not ridicule, it's retaliation. She paused, looking out into a sea of lenses and eyes. And there are moments when the very system meant to protect justice instead tries to manufacture guilt. A flashbulb popped. No one moved. I was charged, she continued, not because I violated the law, but because I challenged those who abuse it. I was dragged through this not because I failed, but because I refused to fold. And now that the evidence has collapsed, now that we all know how this was orchestrated, I say this with no bitterness in my voice, only clarity. I was not charged because I was wrong. I was charged because I was right. Too early. The crowd didn't cheer. Not yet. The words were still too sharp, too fresh. They needed to land. She turned slightly, giving Jasmine the floor. Jasmine didn't step forward. She simply leaned toward the mic. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it cut through the air like a gavel of its own. The truth, she said, pausing just long enough to command the weight of what followed, is the strongest lawyer in any room. And with that, she stepped back. The press erupted, not with shouts, but with questions, hands flying upward, voices overlapping. But AOC didn't answer. She didn't need to, because everything that had to be said had already been spoken. And for the first time in weeks, not a single word of it was a defense. It was declaration. News anchors scrambled to react live. On CNN, a breaking lower third read, AOC cleared. I was right too early. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow wiped a tear from her cheek as she replayed Jasmine's quote. On Fox News, there was a long, unusually quiet pause. Outside the courthouse, the gathered crowd stood in the stunned silence for a beat, then slowly erupted. Not like a rally, not like a political celebration, but like a pressure valve releasing after days of holding its breath. A chant began, not rehearsed, not led, just rippling up from the back like a wave that had been waiting its turn. She stood, she stayed, she won. Truth speaks. Power breaks. Jasmine and AOC didn't wait for questions. They walked down the courthouse steps together. No security detail, no entourage. Just two women walking side by side through a world that had once tried to consume them and now had to face them. Behind them, the courthouse doors slowly closed. And inside those marble walls, the sound of power shifting was no longer metaphor. It was history, and the cameras had caught every second of it. And as Jasmine and AOC disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by chants and flashing cameras, the weight of their victory did not dissolve. It migrated from the steps of the courthouse to the granite corridors of Capitol Hill. Because this wasn't just about clearing a name anymore. It wasn't about a single injustice or a rogue voice caught on tape. It was about a system, one that had just proven how easy it was to twist the law into a blade and hand it to the powerful. 2 days later, room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building was standing room only. The sign outside the door read, Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Integrity, Emergency Session. But everyone inside knew what it really was, the opening shot in a battle for judicial reform that had been delayed for decades. At the center of it sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, sleeves rolled up, not as a guest or a witness, but as the one who had written the resolution now sitting in front of the committee. The Independent Judicial Oversight Act of 2025, a single-page draft, plain language, no legal riddles, just one bold proposal, to establish an independent civilian body with investigative authority empowered to review and hold accountable all federal judges, including justices of the United States Supreme Court. The room buzzed like a live wire. Across from her sat 12 members, 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent. Most were seasoned, all were wary. This wasn't a typical committee hearing. There were no lobbyists in the hallway, no staged handshakes. This was a breach in tradition, a direct challenge to a judicial branch that had long existed behind glass, above reproach. And yet here they were, not because of politics, but because Jasmine Crockett had made ignoring it impossible. She opened with no pleasantries. I don't come here today for revenge, she said, voice calm but slicing through the tension like a scalpel. I come here because last week we saw what happens when judges are allowed to operate in total darkness. We saw how easily the courtroom becomes a weapon when no one is watching the one holding the gavel. A few members shifted in their seats. Not out of disagreement, out of discomfort. This proposal doesn't strip the courts of independence, she continued. It doesn't politicize justice. It protects it. It protects people like Representative Ocasio-Cortez, like the clerk who risked their job to leak a recording, like every American who walks into a courtroom believing it's a place of truth, not theater. She stepped back. No slides, no charts, just words, just fire wrapped in precision. Congresswoman Lily Vaughn, a senior Republican from Indiana and longtime defender of judicial insulation, cleared her throat. And what about separation of powers, Representative Crockett? She asked. What about preserving the impartiality of the bench? Jasmine nodded. She had expected this. Respectfully, Congresswoman, what we witnessed last week wasn't impartiality. It was unchecked authority. There is a difference. Impartiality is earned. Authority, when left unexamined, rots. The room fell still. From across the aisle, Representative Darnell Pierce, a moderate Democrat from Illinois, leaned into his mic. What powers would this commission have exactly? He asked. And how would we prevent it from becoming just another partisan board? Jasmine didn't hesitate. The commission would have subpoena power, access to financial disclosures, internal communications, and courtroom behavior reports. But its members would be selected through a bipartisan nomination panel, equal appointments from both chambers, plus 2 non-political civil rights attorneys selected through public bar associations. Term limited, transparent, auditable. Pierce nodded, slowly, thoughtfully. Then came the voice from the corner of the room. Congressman Adam Harkness, a libertarian-leaning independent and one of the sharpest legal minds in the chamber. And if Justice Clarence Thomas is your case study, he said coolly, are you suggesting this commission could have prevented what happened? Jasmine leaned forward, eyes unwavering. No, I'm saying it could have stopped it sooner, before the forged document reached the courtroom, before the audio file became the only line of defense, before trust in the Supreme Court became a national question mark. Harkness didn't argue. He didn't need to. The argument had already landed. Behind him, the gallery was packed. Law students, journalists, survivors of wrongful convictions, staffers who hadn't been born when Thomas was first appointed, but were now watching his legacy unravel in real time. And through it all, Jasmine never raised her voice. She didn't need volume. She had momentum. She had clarity. And most importantly, she had receipts. Every time a committee member tried to frame her proposal as radical, she returned to the same refrain. Then explain to me how what happened wasn't. By hour 2, even Vaughn, the Republican, softened. She didn't agree. Not yet, but she asked for a printed copy of the resolution. By hour 3, a staffer from the Senate Judiciary Committee was spotted slipping into the back of the room, clipboard in hand. It hadn't even passed the House yet, and the upper chamber had already begun monitoring the fallout. By hour 4, the chair of the subcommittee, Representative Ronald High, spoke into the mic, adjusting his glasses as he did. The chair moves that this resolution be scheduled for markup within 10 days. All in favor? 8 hands rose. It wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be, because for the first time in modern congressional history, a formal vote had been cast to bring the Supreme Court, not in front of cameras, not into culture wars, but under review. Outside the hearing, a reporter shouted, Congresswoman Crockett, do you believe this vote was about Clarence Thomas? Jasmine paused at the top of the stairs. She looked over the crowd, not with triumph, but with purpose. No, she said, this vote was about everyone who comes after him. And then she walked down the steps, each footstep echoing like the prelude to a system waking up from its own silence. And as the resolution moved forward and the Capitol slowly adjusted to its new fault lines, there remained a deeper current beneath all the hearings, headlines, and hashtags. A quiet reckoning that no vote could erase. Because this story was never just about one judge, one voice, or one courtroom. It was about how truth survives when the odds are rigged, how a woman accused for speaking too soon became the face of a system forced to listen, and how another woman, sharp, relentless, uninvited, walked into a space built to exclude her and broke it open with facts, not fury. The lesson wasn't wrapped in a speech or delivered in applause. It lived in the moments between, in Jasmine's silence before she spoke, in AOC's stillness while the world tried to unmake her, in the clerk's trembling hand pressing record. It was a reminder that justice doesn't arrive wearing robes. It walks in when the ones who've been pushed aside refuse to step back. And in that courtroom, beneath the stone and spectacle, the world saw a truth that couldn't be edited. The law means nothing without those brave enough to challenge it when it fails. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.